and welcome to the programme. I'm Nima Abouarte. This week marks exactly a decade since the war in Iraq, and it was a week that saw renewed violence as dozens of people were killed by bombs across Baghdad. So what does this instability mean for a country with huge economic potential? This week we continue with our series looking at Iraq 10 years on, and here's what's coming up in the programme. Baghdad bureaucracy, why central government is stifling private business. Property boom, but will it turn to bust in Iraqi Kurdistan? And away from Iraq, debt doubt. Can Dubai pay back the loans it owes?
Behind closed doors and in private rooms, they've actually negotiated some pretty harsh restructuring terms on their bank lenders.
And a fertile profit while bricks and mortar are taking over the banks of the River Nile. But first, a decade since the US-led military campaign in Iraq, businesses are still struggling in the capital, Baghdad. Now, with the world's fourth largest oil reserves, the country's potential is immense, but it's this very commodity that many say is holding the business community back. And so as part of our series looking at Iraq 10 years since the US-led invasion, Rami Rahayem has this report from Baghdad.
A massive factory compound in An-Nahrawan, northeast Baghdad. Almost 200 factories here, all making one thing: bricks. 10 years on from the war, reconstruction is booming. There are factories like these all over the country, a rare example of success in the private sector. Demand is not a problem. The factories sell all that they produce, but the owners have some bitter complaints.
The government has never supported us. We used to get 11 truckloads of fuel oil a month. Even that wasn't enough. But now they reduced it by 25%, so 8 truckloads a month. We used to work 20 days in a row, and now we stop after 10. Production's dropped by around 50%.
It takes 24 hours inside this furnace for bricks to be ready for construction. That's a lot of heavily subsidized fuel oil. And the government decides how much each business needs.
The Industry Development Department in the Ministry of Industry decides the quantity of fuel oil needed by the industrial unit. They are responsible for deciding on the quantity. Then, based on that, distribution company provides the amount.
Many say the government's role is stifling the private sector. And as the state plans and provides for many businesses, the public sector is expanding. In Iraq, government jobs are in great demand, providing much needed stability in an unstable environment.
Of course, it's good to have a government job. It's the best kind of job, much better than the private sector. In the private sector, you can get fired anytime. With the government, your job is guaranteed and the income is stable. You can get a raise or allowance, and the most important thing, you always have a job with the government.
Oil accounts for 93% of Iraq's revenues. While it finances the expansion of the public sector, the oil industry generates very little employment.
The danger for Iraq is the familiar pattern of an oil economy giving rise to a rich and unaccountable government on one hand and a dependent population on the other.
Everyone agrees that the way forward is diversification, but little has been achieved in that direction. Today, perhaps more than before, it is oil that fuels Iraq's economy.
Rami Rahayem reporting from Baghdad there. Now, while rocket attacks make headlines in the capital just 300 kilometers north in Iraqi Kurdistan, real estate is making news there. Property is proving a popular investment in that region, but it's leading some to ask when boom will turn to bust. Katie Watson reports from the capital, Erbil.
Mohammed proudly takes in the progress of his latest house. It's still only a shell, but once finished, it'll boast 6 bedrooms and an underground gym. Bought for the princely sum of $1 million, it's his 9th purchase in as many years. But this isn't just another of his investments.
One of the main reasons I bought it for my luxury life, for my family. I started in 2004. I invest my money, and of course I get a benefit and gains. Therefore, the revenue day by day increased, and I bought more.
Mohammed's made $500,000 so far on the properties he's bought. He's one of a growing number of people who thinks that his native Kurdistan is the best place to be putting his money. Experts say that it's the locals, not the international speculators, who are fueling this market's growth.
I can say it is 5 categories, First, the Kurds that left this country about maybe 10, 15 years ago, and now they lived in European countries and now they're coming back. And also Arab people from Baghdad and other Arabic cities inside Iraq are coming and starting to invest here. And other 3 categories are people from Syria, from Turkey, and also from Iran that coming to invest here because they know that here is a very interesting place for doubling their money and invest.
Drive 15 minutes outside the centre of Erbil and you'll find yourself in another world. Based on suburban America, it's not a world you'd perhaps expect in Iraq. It was one of the first developments to be built, but more and more are springing up across the city.
Housing developments like this have literally changed the landscape of Erbil. Housing figures are hard to come by, but experts say prices here are anything between 4 and 10 times what they were 10 years ago. That's good news for people who've been able to invest, but on the other end of the scale, people who are first-time buyers or trying to rent, it's a different story.
Blur moved from Sulaymaniyah to Erbil with his young family to take a job as an accountant. It's been a challenge to find a place that he and his family could afford on his salary, but after a month of looking, he finally settled on this place.
The biggest problem that we had in Erbil was finding a good house at a suitable price because we knew monthly rent is very high here. We were searching for a house to rent for lower prices, but monthly rents were $800 and more. We found this house for $500 a month, but that's still very expensive for such a house.
One of the biggest challenges for would-be homebuyers is a lack of finance. Iraq is a cash economy. The banking sector is very underdeveloped and mortgages are hard to come by. So developers are targeting those who can pay for their property with cash, not those who need financing to make their first purchase. And that, say experts, could pose a problem in the future.
In terms of the supply and demand situation, what we are seeing is 80% of the supply that is coming is targeting the upper segment and only 20% is targeting the affordable housing market. But in terms of demand, it's the inverse. 80% of the demand is at the bottom end and only 20% is at the top end. And so what we are likely to see in the future is that you may have a situation where the market is overheated in terms of a lot of these high value properties being bought by investors, but then eventually not being able to sell it because the demand is more at the lower end.
But for cash-rich buyers like Mohammed, he's not deterred. Mohammed's paid for this $1 million mansion because of the money he's made on property here. With construction showing no signs of stopping, talk here is still about to boom. Nobody wants to believe in bust quite yet.
Security is the biggest barrier to investment in Iraq, and sectarian violence has affected big parts of the country, which makes it difficult for businesses to operate. So what can Iraq do to bring investors back? That's a question that Katie Watson put to Farouk Sousa, Chief Middle East Economist at Citi.
It involves enforcing law and order, so I think that has a lot to do with bolstering the Iraqi defense forces, and that's an ongoing process. It also has to do with improving sectarian ties between particularly the Shia and the Sunnis, and the Sunnis feel largely disenfranchised from the modern Iraqi state. But it also has to do with improving the economy, and that's sort of a chicken and egg sort of situation where if you do improve security, you get a better economy. If you get a better economy, security improves. Because the trickle down, actually improving people's lives, having better infrastructure, health, education, access to water, etc., will reduce, I think, the tensions, the social tensions that exist, and ultimately help with the security.
Now, corruption is a huge problem in Iraq. By some estimates, $800 million is exiting the country every week because of corruption.
Iraq languishes towards the bottom of the Transparency International kind of corruption indices and so on. It is a major problem for companies doing business in Baghdad, and it's probably an impediment to other forms of investment outside the oil and gas industry. But really, most of the investment that we're seeing today has been in the oil and gas industry. This is a question for the future. How will other companies, when they go into Iraq, fare with the system, the political system as it is today?
Now we talk about the potential, and we talk about when and if companies come to Iraq because they like the Iraq story, but when will that be? In the last 10 years, people keep on talking about the potential.
Well, the oil and gas companies are already there. The next step is really the big infrastructure companies to go in and develop Iraq's infrastructure. Telecoms is clearly one area where that's already been happening, but there are roads, there are hospitals, there's housing, water, utilities, and so on. That's going to be the next phase. And then further down the line, you will then start to see the likes of the consumer companies, the pharmaceutical companies, and other services companies, banks, and so on, who will then want to capitalize on the Iraqi opportunity. We have to remember that Iraq is going to be rapidly one of the richest economies in the region, with one of the poorest and most and least penetrated markets in the region. And that opportunity, that catch-up opportunity, is enormous. It's something that everybody is interested in. But what impedes people from actually entering the market today, first and foremost, security. Secondly, legal uncertainty. Corruption is part of that.
So the next 10 years, what do you see as the biggest development to be, or the thing to look out for?
Well, I think that absolutely everything across the board in Iraq is going to be booming over the next 10 years. We ourselves are looking at economic growth in excess of 10% over the entire decade. So, I mean, from that point, any sector that you think of practically is a sector to get into in Iraq, because Iraq has suffered from 40 years of underinvestment under Saddam Hussein, 10 years of civil war post-US invasion. Iraq is now beginning to rehabilitate itself. Every sector of the economy is underdeveloped. Every market is underpenetrated. Across the board, there are opportunities in Iraq today.
Farouk Sousa speaking to Katie Watson there. Right, we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, reaping a profit from the banks of the Nile, while farming is becoming more difficult in Egypt. Welcome back to the programme. I'm Nima Abu-Warde. The drama in Cyprus this week is yet another reminder of the perils of cheap borrowing and runaway spending, and Dubai is no stranger to this. Back in 2009, it teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, but was saved from collapse with a bailout from neighbouring Abu Dhabi. 4 years on, and the Emirate is still picking up the pieces, renegotiating loan payments and pushing banks to write off losses after a painful period of job losses and slumping property prices. But on the face of it, things seem to be picking up. Tourism is on the rise, hotel occupancy rates are soaring, new businesses are opening, and Dubai has decided to return to its lofty property ambitions with the announcement of several new mega projects. But it still owes over $100 billion in debt to international companies and investors. And recently, credit ratings agency Moody's said that next year will be especially tough when $20 billion of that debt becomes due. Well, I spoke to Ahmed Al-Anani from the investment bank Exotics and asked him how Dubai has managed its debt to date.
Dubai has basically honored its public debt obligations, the bonds and the sukuk in the market, because these are viewed a bit more systemic, and the contagion effect and the risk perception of Dubai could change dramatically as a result of those. But behind closed doors and in private rooms, they've actually negotiated some pretty harsh restructuring terms on their bank lenders. So they've pushed out a lot of these restructurings.
Because at the end of the day, it's either you listen and you renegotiate, i.e. the banks agree, or they're not going to get their money back.
It's a bit of a carrot and stick kind of approach. You have the local banks on the one side, so that are pretty much their interests are aligned with what the government does and what these entities do. And in the case of international banks, the Standard Charters of the world, HSBCs, these are banks that have a rooted presence in the UAE, in Dubai in particular, the wider UAE, and across the GCC. So they can't really afford to be seen as taking aggressive stances against Dubai.
Really what you're saying is that Dubai cannot afford to pay back its debt.
It's definitely challenging, particularly if you look at the maturity schedule for 2015 and 2016. There's two very key maturities that are coming up. Two companies that were in the spotlight before. The first one is the first tranche of Dubai World. The old restructured loan is coming, the first tranche of that is coming due in 2015. That's $4.4 billion. Then you have Nakheel in 2016. They have about $3 billion due then. In my eye, the jury is still out on how I think both entities are going to have to rely on the government, direct support from the government to meet those maturities. Or there's a very high likelihood, especially in the case of loans, that these maturities are going to get restructured again.
So why are we hearing all these mega projects being announced then?
They're trying to capture on this sentiment, this improved sentiment, and the improving fundamentals, particularly in trade and tourism. The leadership here they have a vision, and it's a very long-term vision. The capital markets are clearly open for Dubai. There's a lot of people that have gained confidence again in the Emirate. I can't blame them for coming back and really trying to reach that vision.
And is credit available? Because there is the belief that Abu Dhabi will come to the rescue again?
What happened in 2009 has definitely set precedent, that there is a backstop from Abu Dhabi. Whether that happens again, whether there is a need for that backstop is a completely different equation. We're in that position again where the precedent was set that Abu Dhabi did backstop Dubai, and I think there's that presumption that that's always going to be there. So, and I think the Emirate is benefiting from that, and that has significantly lowered Dubai's cost of funding, and the market is wide open for it today.
So Dubai will not be allowed to fail?
It's definitely not in the interest of anyone for Dubai to fail. There's a lot of risk here. 2009 has proven to us that it's quite systemic for the entire UAE and probably the wider Middle East. A Dubai failure could be quite catastrophic for everyone. With that in mind, there are steps that are being taken to stem that from happening again.
Ahmed Al-Anani speaking to me earlier. Now let's see what other business stories are making headlines across the region this week. The United Arab Emirates has opened what's said to be the largest concentrated solar power plant in the world. Shams 1 solar plant in Abu Dhabi took 3 years to build and cost about $600 million. Despite the vast desert and year-round sun, solar energy has struggled to take off in recent years here in the Gulf. But the UAE says it wants to see 7% of its electricity come from alternative sources by 2020. Neighbouring Saudi Arabia also has big ambitions to be a solar power exporter. Profits at Dubai-based ports company DP World rose 21% last year to $555 million. Surging trade in Africa, the Middle East, South America and Asia has helped its results, the firm said. And its bottom line got a boost by selling stakes in terminals in Australia, Russia and the UK as the company focused on less developed markets. Shares in the UK high street retailer Marks & Spencer soared this week after reports that Qatari investors were planning a takeover. The business, one of the most famous brands in the UK, has been seen as vulnerable to a takeover because of flagging profits. Qatar has denied it's planning a bid, but it's no stranger to British retail with a stake in supermarket Sainsbury's and ownership of the iconic Harrods department store. Kuwait is amongst the least welcoming countries towards tourists. That's according to a global competitiveness survey by the World Economic Forum. Of the 140 countries surveyed, Kuwait came in at 137, above only Russia, Venezuela and Bolivia. From the Middle East and North Africa, Morocco fared the best when it came to foreign visitors, coming in third place overall. To Egypt, which has seen a huge amount of political turmoil over the past couple of years, and with the authorities' hands full trying to manage the unrest, lax law enforcement has meant that a building boom is taking place in the countryside, threatening Egypt's already precarious food supplies. Rob Young has this report from Egypt.
This desert country has relied on the land along the River Nile to grow food for millennia. The fertile soil easily fed the population, but no longer. A building boom means the farmland is under attack like never before.
We've already laid the foundations for the house and now building a concrete wall around it. We had to scrape the crops away to do this. This plot has gone now, so you won't be able to grow any animal feed or corn.
Building has always gone on along the Nile, but illegal construction work has rocketed since the beginning of the revolution. Farmers claim lax law enforcement means many people no longer fear being prosecuted.
20% of land here in the Delta has been lost since the revolution. This is because of poor government policies. The production rate is decreasing because agricultural land is being taken over and built on.
The problems in the countryside are causing pain in the cities. The government says it's trying to crack down on the illegal building and increase the amount of food farmers produce. But Egypt already imports about half of what it eats, and prices are rising. Worries about food security are exacerbated by climate change.
Egypt is ranked as one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. All this, of course, will affect the food productivity and will affect harshly the food security of the people.
There is some hope, though, thanks to a growing number of innovative farmers. Egypt does have a small number of advanced farms like this one here, but most of the produce grown in them is exported to customers in Europe. But this farm is different because the stuff that's grown here, like this lettuce, is sold to Egyptian customers. And it's techniques like this which could be one of the answers to the country's food security problems. The crops here are grown in water-filled pipes in climate-controlled greenhouses.
The yields are, in certain cases, 6 times higher, sometimes 15 times higher than what is grown in the soil, because you need much less soil, much less land, and therefore you have a high productivity. This would be a solution for Egypt, I think.
Food security is just one of many challenges Egyptians face as they try to assure their political and economic future. But while they grapple with those huge difficulties, they've got to safeguard their food supplies too.
Rob Young reporting from Egypt there. Right, our time is up for this week. I do hope you've enjoyed our programme. Before we go, let's see how the region's main markets performed. And remember, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address is middleeastbiz@bbc.co.uk. And you can go to Twitter and Facebook for latest photos and news from our teams across the world. Now, next week, we're back in Kurdistan with a young population and plenty of business opportunities opening up. Is a booming Kurdistan working for everyone? Until then, from me, Nima Abu Warte, and the rest of the team, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.